I've been a teacher for 42 years in the public schools, 5 years in a medium security men's prison, and the last 32 years teaching sociology and political science at Coker College. I've done human rights work in 8 countries now and monitored some foreign elections, run a couple times for U.S. Congress. Interested in political assassinations because I came of age in 1968 in Los Angeles. We had riots in 100 cities. The country was divided over Vietnam. I could see the air that I was breathing, and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated that year. So as an undergraduate, I took a class on political assassinations. And as a teacher, I noticed that whenever I talk about political assassinations, all the students were listening. So I realized, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to do more reading on this to do it justice. And by the second year of teaching, I realized I could talk about this for a week. When I got to Coker College, they allowed me to teach a class on political assassinations. So I have stayed the course. After 27 years, finally finished the book on media coverage of the assassination of John Kennedy.
So tell me the name of the book. And
Burying the Lead, the Media and the Assassination of JFK.
And why the assassination of JFK? Why did you decide that you wanted to study this and spend years, decades of your life?
It was a public execution of a popular president that was likely to get reelected. We never got to the bottom of it. It led directly to a loss of public confidence in government. What an irony. Kennedy was making government work more effectively, and after his assassination, people lost faith in the American government. Trust in government, November 1963, before Kennedy's assassination, was at about 2/3. By 1967, it was down to 1 in 3. The media never did their job on this, and students would ask me heartfelt questions about why haven't we figured this out? This is so important. And their earnest questioning inspired me, so I tried to stay the course on things.
So since you're the author and you're the scholar, you tell me, where do we begin here?
Well, that's why it's always easier to teach an 18-week class on this rather than doing the brief version. But anybody who sees the Zapruder film sees the president's head going backward and the blood and brains hitting the motorcycle cop behind the president, which would indicate a shot from the front, not necessarily all the 3 shots from the rear. And as you read through the Warren report, which was set up by President Johnson to look into the assassination of President Kennedy, you read that 21 law enforcement officers thought the shots came from the front. You have 51 witnesses that said the same thing. That was enough to get me started. I didn't know if there were 3 shots fired, 4, 5. It looked like at least 1 came from the front. And you can get lost in the forensic evidence on this, but I stopped at the point where I figured that at least 1 shot came from the front, which would mean 2 shooters, which would mean a conspiracy, which was not what the Warren report came up with. And as you go through the Warren report, 888 pages of legalese, you realize that it doesn't match the 26 volumes of hearings and exhibit that it supposedly is based upon. Yet as soon as the Warren report was released, prior to the election in 1964, it was greeted by the media with widespread acclaim that they had the bottom line, and if you didn't agree with this, you were a fool or you weren't patriotic. On the very day that the Warren report was released, CBS had a 2-hour piece, as they said, illustrating the Warren report. This is as it is released before the 26 volumes of hearings and exhibit that the Warren report is based upon was even released. It was also greeted by the New York Times and the Washington Post as being a report in archaeological detail and a remarkable effort looking at what had happened. And you could see early on that they were supporting the Warren Report, whether it comported with the truth or not. You know, if we turn the clock back a little bit further, the Zapruder film, which was taken by an amateur photographer in Dealey Plaza, that most people know from the movie JFK, was purchased by Time Life. But Time Life never printed all of the frames in the Zapruder film, and they misdescribed what was in the Zapruder film to make it appear that the president was shot from behind. And one has to account for why, if they spent $150,000, which was real money back then, they wouldn't print all of the frames and they wouldn't describe what's actually there in the Zapruder film. Years later, people looked into the connections between Time Life and its editor, C.D. Jackson, and the CIA. C.D. Jackson had worked with the CIA during the Cold War at the highest level on propaganda operations. Well, as soon as I started to put this together, I realized there's more to this story than we're hearing.
Let me stop you and go back so that we don't miss it. When you say that CBS came out with a 2-hour documentary the day that the Warren Commission released its report, how do you pull together a 2-hour documentary on a report that involved and big in that amount of time?
You're right. And it was a red flag to me. And I got to this information after grad school in political science. So I was willing to, and I'd met people who had worked at the highest levels in the CIA, and then started to realize CBS cooperated with the CIA during the Cold War. They'd cooperated during World War II with a precursor to the CIA, the OSS, and they saw this as their patriotic obligation during a Cold War with communism that was anti-God and anti-freedom, and that alliance was actually quite strong. They cooperated with the CIA on a number of operations. They weren't the only mass media outlet that did that. NBC did. Reader's Digest did. There were a number of them that cooperated with the CIA. And this information came out in Carl Bernstein's piece in Rolling Stone in 1977. And some of this information came out in Senator Church's investigation of the CIA in 1976. The CIA had, at that time during the Cold War, between 400 and 600 assets in the media that worked with them. Now, there was a spectrum of relationships. Some, it was just people that were debriefed after going to Eastern Europe to do some reporting, and they'd talk over dinner with the CIA. Others put out pieces that the CIA had written. So it was a range of relationships, and according to Senator Church, between 400 and 600 media assets worked with the CIA during that time. I also talked with one of the Senate staffers that worked on that committee. His name is Locke Johnson. He's a professor of political science at the University of Georgia. And this is 28 years ago, I asked him, well, I read through the report that said 400 to 600 reporters had a relationship with the CIA of one sort or another. And he looked at me and said, at least that many. So I think those relationships, now this is circumstantial, of course, could well have been put in operation. And you're wondering why. Why? You know, if it wasn't Oswald alone, what was going on here? Because we have this strange guy Oswald that it's all blamed on. And it all gets blamed on him very clearly after Jack Ruby kills Oswald. Then the FBI and the Deputy Director of the Justice Department, Nicholas Katzenbach, put out a memo to say, the public must be convinced that Oswald is the lone assassin and he did not have Confederates. This was sent out to the mass media from the FBI and from the Justice Department. And this is before the investigation has gotten underway. And you see reporting at that point from mainstream sources, and then focusing on Oswald as the sole assassin. And again, this is circumstantial, but we can see that change of reporting on it.
Wouldn't that be a red flag to a good reporter that this is exactly what we need to do, the opposite? That we need to go after why they're pushing this story and not telling us the entire story?
Absolutely. And we have reports from some reporters that FBI people had visited them and made calls to steer away from certain aspects of the assassination and their coverage. We have a reporter named Connie Kritzenberg, who was from the Dallas Morning News, who was actually in Dealey Plaza at the time, and when she wrote up her piece, the FBI visited the Dallas Morning News. So we have some very heavy-handed pressures, presumably on the grounds of national security. Now let me put the best case on this for why there might have been such government involvement and such a push to blame this on Oswald. We're about a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. There is a fear that we could go to war with the Soviet Union. Oswald is passing out, during his life, Fair Play for Cuba literature. He's passing it out of an office that was run by a former FBI guy named Guy Bannister. Now, at this point, everybody wants to slow up and it gets kind of confusing. But Oswald had worked in the Marines, had a military intelligence card when they arrested him. Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union, lived there, married a Soviet woman, comes back into the United States, and he's meeting with FBI and CIA people in the United States. No one really knows who he's working for or what's going on. Day after the assassination, J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, is talking to President Lyndon Johnson. And Hoover is saying, you know, when Oswald visited Mexico City to try to go to the Cuban and Russian embassies to defect again, the pictures aren't of someone who is Oswald, and the voice is not Oswald's voice on the phone conversations. Now, who is impersonating Oswald in Mexico City to supposedly be visiting the Cuban and Russian embassies? The source of the information is the CIA in Mexico City. Now, that doesn't prove that those actions of the Secret Service that have been condemned in every investigation that we've had of the Secret Service and what they didn't do properly during the presidential motorcade in Dealey Plaza, it doesn't mean that the CIA set it in motion, but those connections are there. And that's why it's important, after we win the Cold War, for the American public not to be treated like children, so that we get the files released, so we find out our history. This is the role of the media. The media is the fourth estate. They're supposed to be the lifeblood of democracy. If they're asking these questions, the public is asking these questions. And when they ask these questions about who killed John Kennedy, they'll ask those questions about who killed Martin Luther King, because the same type of security stripping is in place. The same type of cover-up is in place, and America will get our history. John Kennedy said to Eastern Europe with Radio Liberty in 1962, in order to inspire those people to overthrow communism, he said, "We seek a free flow of information. A nation that is afraid to judge truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that's afraid of its people." And I'm afraid it was prophetic, and it's as valid today in the United States as it was to Eastern Europe back in 1962.